watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael. On a Monday evening, we are going to be discussing the Manualists, a group of theologians that our guest is going to be speaking about specifically on the papacy and papal authority over the liturgy, according to the Manualists. But who are the Manualists? Why are they important? That's what our guest is going to explain as well. We have Timothy Wilson. Welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Good. So let's go ahead and dive in. Tell me a little bit about yourself, your biographical information. I've seen that you like to study the Manualists. It seems that you read Latin pretty well. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, there isn't much to say. I mean, I guess in terms of education, I don't have much to talk about. I graduated from high school. I've got a associate's degree in arts, so nothing fancy. I had 4 years of Latin in high school, and then ever since I graduated in 2010, I've basically been, I guess you could say, I started with the Manualists and started working backwards in the history of theology. I don't really. I mean, in my working hours, I'm just like a line cook at a restaurant, so I'm not exactly a fancy person, but I do really like to read Latin. I like to study the theologians. I guess I should say that maybe as a clarifying point, I don't focus exclusively on the Manualists. I actually have been focusing more and more on the authors of like the 1500s, 1600s, especially the 1700s. Ever since I discovered Benedict XIV and all of his fellow 18th century writers, But anyway, so that's basically what I focus on.
Awesome. So, tell us a little bit about the Manualists. Who are they? Before we dive into the topic itself, I think it's important that we set the stage here because not everybody is going to be familiar with them. So, who are these Manualists that we speak of here?
So the term usually refers to, I want to say chronologically speaking, it refers to the theological and canonical authors of like the 19th century, 20th century specifically. When you say Manualist, that's usually what people who know about these things think about. And basically they were professors who authored texts, oftentimes just, either for their teaching in the universities that they were at, or or else it was just the result of their teaching, and so they would compile it into volumes to be published. And I mean, there's a distinctive, I'm not sure I want to call it a tradition, but there is a group of authors called the Manualists, and they oftentimes follow a set formula, I guess, and their being formulaic is often a criticism of them. I'd say it's actually helpful in a lot of times because it helps you to find specific topics that they would talk about, and you don't have to go through the entire set of volumes. You can just go straight to the treatise on the sacraments in general or something like that. So there were a lot of them. A lot of manuals were published, some considered more excellent than others. You had lots of Roman theologians, especially Giovanni Perrone, who wrote a magnificent set of theological prelections. His student, or one of his students, Cardinal Franzelin, who I'm sure some people know, Cardinal Billot. I've never really figured out how to pronounce his name. Garrigou Lagrange, I guess you could call him a manualist, although Dr. Meinard might I don't remember if he disagrees with that characterization or not. But yeah, so they were very influential in the formation of clergy, especially, and that's also one of the other things that comes under attack. Is they're formulaic, and they're not very groundbreaking or original. They're often considered stagnant, but nevertheless, they were very important, practically at least, in the intellectual formation of the clergy, which in turn formed, how the clergy would, address errors of the age, expound the church's own position, etc. However, I guess aside from the 19th and 20th centuries, they wouldn't properly be called manualists, but of course, there are also the post-Tridentine theologians who didn't really write manuals in the proper sense, but they were very often referenced in the manualists. So you'll often see, a manualist writing about some topic of, sacramental theology, and he'll be constantly referring to Suarez or Bellarmine or, one of those guys, because they're like I wouldn't say the primary sources really, but they're usually much more detailed.
Yeah. Well, go ahead and dive into the topic itself. What was the manualist view, or views, I should say, on the papacy and its authority over the liturgy and its development and modifications to the liturgy?
Okay. I hope. I'm sorry about this camera. This was not the.
No, you're good.
This was not the original intent. I wasn't planning to use my laptop, so the view is not all that great. So I guess if I could do like a preliminary, sort of framing.
Sure.
So I guess to start with, I've run into a lot of traditional literature on the topic of the Pope and liturgy, and just the Pope and more in general. And there are a couple of things that keep popping up when, at least in the online world. The IRL is a little different. On the online world, you often have some quotes that are shared from the Council of Trent, from Pius V, and I kept seeing these, and at that point in time, I had started to get a little skeptical about that kind of literature, or rather the way in which it was used. So I started looking further into it, and I immediately found that there's actually a vast collection of theologians who commented directly on the Tridentine and Pian texts, in question. I don't know if Suarez was the first one I found, but there were just a whole bunch of them. So see if I can pull this up. I don't know. Are you able to do a screen share here? Not sure.
Yeah. It should let you. Look at the bottom where it says share.
Yeah. Okay. I see it.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Here it is.
Okay.
So right now it shows. Yeah. There we go.
All right. It's been a long time since I used PowerPoint, so I'm not even sure where the full screen is. I don't know.
I think it is. Let's see. Go to view. Top of PowerPoint. Yeah. And then, it should be one of these. Let's see. Because I rarely use it as well. Go slideshow. Yeah, go to that one at the top next to view. Slideshow from beginning. Yeah.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, so this is the first one that I ran into. And there are a variety of translations of it. And there's a certain phrase in it that is often leaned on very, very closely. So basically it just says that, they're condemning a heretical proposition, And so the council says, if anyone says that the received and approved rites of the Catholic Church, accustomed to be used in the solemn administration of the sacraments, may be despised or omitted by the ministers without sin and at their pleasure, or may be changed by any pastor of the churches, whomsoever, to other new ones, let him be anathema. And the bolded text there is usually used to show that the Pope, in fact, has no authority to change the rites and the liturgy, because he also is a pastor of the churches. And Father Gregory Hess especially has, I think he's probably done the most to popularize this line. He focuses on the word quemcumque, which doesn't just mean any, it means any whomsoever. And so he reasons, well, therefore, it must mean that the Pope is also included within that prohibition. And admittedly, it's kind of difficult to look at this text because there are a couple of negations that can confuse you. You'll notice, so I've got 3 different translations for this canon here. There's one from 1848. There's the one used in the Denzinger, which I think was like the 1950 edition or something. And there's also a 1941 translation by a Dominican. And all of them say every or any. And I don't know if I want to get into the nitty-gritty of trying to break down the propositional content here. Basically, the idea is that there's a heretical proposition, namely that the rites can be changed into other new ones by any pastor whomsoever. The council takes that proposition and judges it heretical. So what is condemned is that it is not the case that any pastor whomsoever can change the rites into other new ones. It's a universal negation, but that does not rule out the particular affirmation that, you know, some pastor of the church can. All it's saying is that it is not the case that any pastor can, which is actually, if you look at the history of the canon, that comes out. The original version of this in the deliberations of the theologians was that Quem vis pastorum, you can see right there. Basically, it's saying this assertion was that any pastor can change the forms or formulae of the sacraments at will. And the council wanted to address that. And so that's exactly what it condemned. Now, how does this fit into the theologians? Well, the idea is that this text is often appealed to say that it limits the power of the Roman pontiff over the liturgy, but the theological tradition overwhelmingly, like in the sense that I've surveyed dozens and dozens and dozens of theologians who reference this canon when they're talking about the liturgy, the sacraments, the Pope, and all of them interpret it the exact opposite, as showing that the church, by this definition, has reserved to the supreme authority of the church the power to change the liturgy. Not the inferior ministers, but only the supreme. Anyway, so there's another Tridentine text, which you've alluded to in several of your pieces. I think I don't remember if it was in any of the videos, but I know it was in one of your articles. And I've commented about this before. The session 21, chapter 2, where it's talking about the dispensation of the Eucharist under 1 or 2 species, and it makes a claim about the church's power over the sacraments and the dispensation thereof. And so it declares that this power has ever been in the church, that in the dispensation of the sacraments, their substance being untouched, it may ordain or change what things soever it may judge most expedient for the profit of those who receive or for the veneration of the said sacraments according to the difference of circumstances, times, and places. And at the end it says it's not lawful to reprobate this custom or to change it at pleasure without the authority of the church itself. And I'm sure that this is kind of a tired reference to some people. However, the importance of it is that it is one of the primary magisterial texts used to vindicate to the church and to the Roman pontiff specifically the supreme authority over the liturgy. If the Latin phrase you can see there, salva elorum substantia, that if you plug that into Google, you're going to find it all over the place in theologians, because that's like the key phrase, is that you have the substance of the sacraments, the matter and form, and then you have the ceremonies and rites, which have been super added to them. The substance of the rites has been established by Jesus Christ himself and cannot be changed. In principle, everything else is. Now, of course, this does not mean that everything else should be changed, but the power of the church and of the Pope in this matter is clearly laid down to extend that far. And this is brought out more clearly when you see what the theologians themselves say. First one, and caveat, I only managed to get Suarez in here in the PowerPoint, so I can talk about the others, but I don't have their text in the PowerPoint. I can call them up on a Word document or something. So, as I said, both of these texts from Trent were used by the theologians and canonists, and also the liturgical rubricists, commenting on the rubrics of the Roman Missal. They were used to vindicate supreme authority over the liturgy to the church and the Pope. The first one is Francisco Suarez. Suarez hopefully is known to a lot of people, at least. He was a Jesuit theologian and wrote a great deal and was extremely influential in theology, especially. Some of his more well-known treatises would be his Defense of the Catholic Faith against the errors of the Anglicans, which Peter Simpson has translated in full on his website for free. He also wrote extensive commentaries on St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae. They're usually displayed under the, so it's not just commentary on, they're usually introduced as the specific treatise being discussed. The one in question here is his treatise on the sacraments, on the third part of St. Thomas's Summa. And in Disputation 15, he's talking about the sacraments in general. And here in this disputation, he talks about the ceremonies and rites of the sacraments. And of course, it helps to know that at the time of the Protestant Reformation, a lot of things were said by the so-called reformers regarding the ceremonies and rites of the church. They were, characterized as human precepts. They were scorned, rejected. It was said that only the ceremonies, if there were any, that were instituted by Christ in the scriptures were able to be used and commanded. That's one of the things they focus on. Is some of the more moderate Protestants say that ceremonies and rites are fine. They can be conducive to devotion and whatnot, but they cannot be commanded. They cannot bind the conscience as a law. And of course, the church's theologians did not agree, as well as the church herself. And so they opposed that position of the Protestants by arguing for the laicity of ceremonies and the ability of the church to command them under pain of sin to her members, and especially to her ministers. So in Disputation 15, section 3, this is where Suarez argues specifically for the liturgical sacramental ceremonies. in the previous two sections, he had explained what ceremonies are, and I'd love to talk about it, but it's a lot of text, and I'm hoping to at least get partway through this list that I have here. So the way that Suarez and the other theologians frame this issue is, as I mentioned earlier about Trent, they divide it into the substance of the sacrament and the ceremonies and rites superadded to the sacrament. And those ceremonies and rites are usually described as being instituted by the church for greater solemnity, for the reverence of the sacrament, for instruction of the faithful, and among other things, also to help distinguish Catholics from non-Catholics. Cardinal Bellarmine goes into much of the same content in his own treatise on the sacraments. And I should mention that actually I already have translated that part of Bellarmine completely, and it's on my blog, which I'll hopefully remember to share before this is over. So anyway, Francisco, after having discussed what ceremonies are, here he says that the sacramental ceremonies, which are aside from the substance of the sacraments, are not from Christ. They have not been established by Christ. They are not of divine law, and therefore they arose from apostolic or ecclesiastical law. And here he adduces Trent, Session 21, Chapter 2, which says the substance of the sacraments being untouched. What remains has been committed to the church, which we shall confirm more extensively in the conclusion which follows. There's a lot more regarding this to follow. Therefore, it is a sign that the ceremonies which are beside the substance of the sacraments were not prescribed in particular by Christ the Lord. This is actually following the reason of St. Thomas in his Summa. He makes a similar point about the difference between the old law and the new law. I think it's question 108 in the Prima Secundae of the Summa. So he's just finished talking about the old law, and now he's talking about the new law and the way in which it differs, the way in which it has fulfilled the old law, and he focuses on the ceremonial precepts of the old law and how they compare to what might be called ceremonial precepts in the new law. And he makes the point that the new law is a law of liberty, and thus the ceremonial precepts were not to be determined in such particular detail by God himself. Rather, it was left to the church to establish them herself over the course of time. Here he talks about the, I guess you could say, the historical variety of the rites to show that Christ did not himself establish rites as divine law. Here he speaks about the old law being the law of servitude, consisting more in exterior burdens than in the interior spirit of grace. The new law is the law of grace and the Spirit, and thus in it Christ only gave those things which are the necessary means or useful instruments for obtaining grace, but the rest he committed to his church to be appointed by her. And then shortly after, this is where he comments explicitly on Canon 13 of Session 7. He writes, whence are understood the words of the cited canon of the Tridentine Council, where it says, if anyone saith that the received and approved rites of the Catholic Church want to be used in the solemn administration of the sacraments may be scorned or contemned, or without sin be omitted at pleasure by the ministers, or be changed by any pastor whomsoever of the churches into other new ones, let him be anathema. And here he explains what is meant by that canon, as these words are to be understood chiefly of the universal rites received in the universal church, especially the Roman Church, of which rites the council does not say that they can be changed by no pastor, but not by whomsoever. For they cannot be changed by inferior bishops, because universal rites such as these have their origin from a more universal and superior power. But inferiors are not able to derogate those things which have been instituted and commanded by a superior. And this is the main text. The Supreme Pontiff, from the plenitude of his power, would be able to change rites of this sort, because his power is not inferior, but is the same as that from which rites of this sort took their origin. This is a point that is made fairly often by the Manualists and by the earlier theologians after Trent. And there's a maxim of law that's preserved in I think it's the Liber Sextus of the Decretals. It basically says that everything is dissolved by the same cause from whence it came. The idea is that the rites and ceremonies of the sacraments, basically the entire liturgy, came to be from the authority of the bishops and the popes, and ultimately of the popes. And so it is by their authority that they can be changed or preserved, whichever they think is good and useful for the good of the church. And he goes on to say, yet he never does or will do this without great necessity or utility, especially in these observances which are most ancient in the church and are believed to have been given by the apostles and perpetually observed. And then he goes on later and says, yet one must beware of scandal and changes of this sort, in consideration of divine worship and the fruit of souls must always be kept in mind for the opportunity of times and places. That last sentence shows up several times, actually, lest anyone think that the post-Tridentine theologians and the Manualists are asserting an absolute and unlimited power of the Pope over the liturgy. They often will include this caveat, saying that changes of such ancient observances are possible. They are not necessarily recommended. There's a distinction that people often make, well, the Pope can change this or that thing, but should he? And that's basically what he's getting at here. Because the ceremonies and rites of themselves are not immutable. They're always subject to the superior authority of the Pope and of the Church Universal, but the principles of law dictate that changes be not made that are not necessary, that are not made to meet some pressing need or advantage that is foreseen from that change. So I think, I want to say it was Michael, I've seen it in Michael Davies in one of his, I think it was in Pope Paul's New Mass. And he's talking about the liturgical changes, and he doesn't deny that the Pope has authority over these rites and ceremonies. But he does say that the Pope is morally limited, i.e., not to do something that is unnecessary and potentially damaging. So there's the power, but then there's the use of that power, which is a common distinction made by the canonists and theologians. So Suarez thinks that the ceremonies and the rites which have been adjoined to the matter and form of the sacraments are ultimately of ecclesiastical institution. Ecclesiastical meaning both the apostles and their successors, because the apostles and their successors enjoy the same authority over all of this stuff. The apostles obviously have a greater venerableness, and hence what they have established, I guess you could say, deserves more reverence and respect, but at the same time, the authority is the same. I don't remember if I have anything after that. Yeah, that's all I managed to put together.
All right. Now, did you say you had some other manualists that you could bring up and read as well?
Yes. It's actually the problem. There are a lot. So there's Suarez, who he's like the first guy that I think comes to mind when I talk about this because he's generally well known. He's got a generally good reputation, except among certain kinds of, I want to say, strict observance Thomists, amongst whom I usually count myself. But some of them object to Suarez on more fine philosophical points. But he's basically representative of the rest of the theologians. But there are a number of other significant commentators who basically more or less follow the same lines as he does. So the Salmanticenses, they're the Carmelite commentators on the Summa of St. Thomas. And actually, I've got their set on my shelf back there. But in their treatise on the sacraments, they more or less follow the same path that Suarez does, talking about the ceremonies, what they are, by whom they can be established, in what manner they can be established and commanded, and they also comment directly on the texts from Trent. Let me see. So when the theologians talk about the stuff that is not the matter and form of the sacraments, and they just talk about the rites and ceremonies, the terminology kind of differs, partly because of the way that Trent speaks in other parts of session 21 and 22. So there's the word ceremony and there's the word rite. And some theologians take ceremony to be synonymous with rite, and others take them to be different. I think it's that the ceremonies are the words that, no. Yeah, the ceremonies are the actions and gestures of the minister, and the rites are the words. But like I said, the distinction is not maintained by all of the post-Tridentine authors. I think Barufaldi, in his commentary on the Rituale Romanum, gives a brief exposition of the authors who think this or that. But anyway, so the Salmanticenses, when they're talking about to them, were comprehended in the ancient law by the word ceremonies, as St. Thomas explains in Prima Secundae, question 101, article 4. But then he narrows his treatment by the name ceremonies. We do not now mean the sacraments, because the sacraments themselves can be considered ceremonies in as much as they are composed of words and gestures. But he's only talking about the other rites, which are ordered proximately or remotely to the sacraments and pertain to some profession of Christianity. So he talks about classic examples of these are like the sign of the cross, sprinkling of holy water, unction with oil, exorcism, consecrations of shrines, prayers of the Mass. All of those things basically fall under this heading. And so he says, I wonder if I can share this again.
By the way, several are asking, would you be able to share this document with these quotes?
Oh, yes.
That way I can add it to the description so everybody can have access to it as well. You don't necessarily have to do it now. I'm just
okay.
I think they're just asking after the show. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that was in the cards, but didn't get around to it yet.
Okay.
So what the Salmanticenses say about these is, it is to be held with sure faith that besides the sacraments immediately instituted by Christ, there are also sacramentalia, that is, as we have explained above, sacred ceremonies or rites ordered proximately or remotely to the sacraments and pertaining to the cult, i.e. the worship of the Catholic religion. In these rites the Church has laudably instituted, and in which she is able to make changes as is necessary. The Tridentine Council supposes and proves this truth in session 21, chapter 2, where it says, it furthermore declares that this power has ever been in the Church, Then in the dispensation of the sacraments, their substance being untouched, and may ordain or change what things soever it may judge most expedient, etc., etc. And then he gives examples of Christ using rites and ceremonies to prove that rites and ceremonies in themselves are not bad, because obviously he's addressing the Protestants. So after having given those examples and showing that ceremonies in themselves are not evil, as some had said, then he comes to the Catholic position. In the first place, it follows that Christ gave to the Church the power of instituting ceremonies. This authority the apostles exercised, and their successors, the pontiffs and bishops, by instituting peculiar rites which the Church presently observes. This has sufficiently been proved by what has been said, and it is confirmed all the more by St. Augustine in his 119th epistle, chapter 15, where he lays down a general and very fine rule, namely, whatever are not repugnant to good morals, nor to the faith, and which have an exhortation of a better life, wherever they may be seen to be instituted, are not to be condemned, but praised and followed. Furthermore, it follows that this sort of power of instituting ceremonies, or sacramentalia, for the whole Church, pertains to the Supreme Pontiff, since the governance of the whole Church pertains to him. It also pertains to a general council with dependence upon the Supreme Pontiff's approval, confirming it. Bishops also are able to institute fitting rites of this sort in their dioceses, so long as the Supreme Pontiff does not contradict it. And he gives examples of Chrysostom, Basil, Ambrose, the institution of their peculiar rites. Then he brings up Trent, Session 7, Canon 13, to show that this authority belongs to the Church. And then he's explaining the canon. He says, here it speaks of the more universal rites commonly received in the whole Church, and it does not deny that they can be changed absolutely speaking, but by any pastor whomsoever. He's making the same point as Suarez. For such rites have their origin from a universal and superior power, contrary to which bishops and inferior pastors are unable to issue regulations. But for the opposite reason, the pontiff would be able to do so from the plenitude of his power. Yet he will not do it without great necessity and the most evident usefulness, especially when the rites are very ancient and believed to be handed on by the apostles. As I said, that sort of caveat at the end regarding the use of the power, as opposed to what he can, what it's capable of in itself, that's a fairly common theme, especially when talking about apostolic rites and ceremonies. I want to say you see it in Quarto as well. He was a influential rubricist who published a very long and involved commentary on the rubrics of the Missal and of the Breviary. I want to say the text from Augustine, his epistles, I believe it's in the old numbering, it's epistle 118 and 119, letters to Januarius. They're actually very important and very, very used in the theologians discussing the authority of the Church over the liturgy, because it's Augustine writing to Januarius about the liturgy and the ceremonies and rites which are used all over the world. Obviously in the time of Augustine, because this was long prior to Pius V, or even of earlier pontiffs who had made moves to start to centralize the liturgy under the authority of Rome, rather than leaving it to local jurisdictions. Augustine's letter is characterized by a kind of localism, which was common to greater or lesser degrees all the way up into the Council of Trent and Pius V, when he promulgated Quo Primum and more or less centralized the whole of the Western liturgy under the power of the Pope and the Congregation for Sacred Rites, which was established later by Pope Sixtus V, I believe. After Pius did that, that's when, I guess you could say, I would say that the liturgy kind of, I don't want to say froze, but in a certain sense it did, because now with control, at least legally speaking, of the liturgy in the hands of Rome and the Congregation of Sacred Rites, changes were forbidden to anyone under the Pope. Obviously, the Pope and the Congregation of Sacred Rites had the authority to introduce changes that they thought were needed or useful, but that permission was not extended anymore to bishops, especially because bishops had often been the ones establishing new rites. So I guess it might help to look at some later authors, because the post-Tridentine theologians are more or less, I don't want to say they're all exactly the same, but it gets kind of monotonous, I guess, because they're reducing the same text, basically saying the same thing. It might be helpful to bring up St. Alphonsus Liguori, though. He's number 21. St. Alphonsus wrote a dogmatic work against the heretics of the pretended Reformation. It was originally in Italian, but there was a Latin translation of it made and published in the early part of the 20th century, along with all of his other dogmatical works, which were either already in Latin or had been written originally in Italian. And he wrote, this dogmatic work is more or less a commentary following the canons and decrees of Trent. So it's divided up by session, basically. And when he gets to session 7, he says, talking about Canon 13, there is no doubt that the Church has the power of establishing and changing the rites or ceremonies to be used in the administration of the sacraments, as the Tridentine Synod itself declared in session 21, chapter 2, with these words: this power has ever been in the Church, that in the dispensation of the sacraments, their substance being untouched, etc. Yet this power, he says, is the Church's alone, whence she has rightly forbidden that the rites be changed. Otherwise, as St. Augustine says, the new things appointed by the different ministers would perturb the order and common peace of the Church. So this is one of the arguments usually used to, while not saying anything bad about the diversity of rites, they're extolling the virtues of uniformity of worship. And that's something that Pius V himself appeals to, especially at the opening of Quota Nobis, when he promulgated the breviary. Oh, sorry. I need a drink real quick. So the treatment of the theologians after Trent through the 1700s kind of follows the same formula, because the common formula was just a treatise on the sacraments in general. Somewhere in there, you're going to include a section on the ceremonies and the rites, because, the first couple of centuries after Trent, the primary orientation was to refute the errors of the Protestants as they continued to spread. And that formula more or less stayed constant. I want to say all the way up until, basically until the manuals stopped being composed. The oldest manual I know is from, I think, 1972 by Sebastian Tromp. Let me pull up the... Giovanni Perrone, who I mentioned earlier, very influential Roman theologian, I think he was one of the more, I think he was basically one of the founders of the Roman school, as it was called in the 19th century. There's an extremely interesting article that a fellow wrote about Perowne and the way that he interacted with John Henry Newman on the topic of development of doctrine, because Perowne is referencing Newman constantly in his the works that he wrote before Newman converted. And Newman's writings on development of doctrine helped shape how Perowne thought of it himself. I'll try to remember to give you the name of the author if I can remember. So he's talking in his prelections about the received and approved rights of the Catholic Church. And once again, he appeals to Trent. So this is from the 1843 edition of his Treatise on the Sacraments in General. And the thesis that he advances is that the received and approved rights of the Catholic Church, accustomed to be used in the solemn administration of the sacraments, can neither be contemned nor omitted without sin by the ministers at will, nor changed into other new ones by any pastor of the churches. Obviously, it's just a restatement of Session 7, Canon 13. And he says that here. And he says, this definition touches directly upon the power with which the church has been provided by Christ of instituting those things which pertain to the administration of the sacraments, their substance remaining untouched, as the same synod declared in Session 21, Chapter 2, and I won't read it again because I've said it so many times already. For this reason, to contemn the received and approved rights of the Catholic Church, or to omit them at will or change them into new ones on private authority, is equally to deny the Church's power conferred by Christ, which absolutely cannot be done while still retaining the faith. And I want to note that he says, change them into new ones on private authority, because as every theologian who I've seen commenting on this canon says, it's talking about lower authority. It's not talking about the supreme authority, which vindicates to itself, supreme power over the liturgy. There's a footnote here where he says, here it ought to be noted that as much with this as with other theses of this kind, they are of faith to the degree that they contain a fact conjoined with right. The fact in the present proposition is the rites or ceremonies themselves which are used in the solemn administration of the sacraments. These rites certainly are neither divinely instituted nor contained in divine revelation. The right is the power conferred by Christ to the Church of instituting rites or ceremonies of this sort, and divine revelation is clear regarding this right. Hence, to deny or scorn these rites, or to teach that they can be omitted without sin, is to attack, at least indirectly, this very right which belongs to the Church from divine institution, and this is in fact contra fidem. This is a line that is often, it keeps coming back. Namely, the idea is that the obligation imposed by the Church regarding the ceremonies and the rites is not one directly of divine law, because the very institutions that she is commanding to the ministers are established by her own authority. And therefore, she has the authority to regulate, change, improve the rites as she sees fits, according to the circumstances of times and places, according as she judges it needful for the times. And I was going somewhere with that. Oh well. Anyway, so after Perowne, I'm trying to skip over a bunch of these. Bishop Kenrick. I guess I could go over Franzelin. Franzelin, as I mentioned, was a student of Perowne's, and he is, I believe he's generally regarded as one of the principal authorities in magisterial studies, especially from his work on sacred tradition. And in his treatise on the sacraments in general, following the aforementioned formula, as I mentioned, he writes, it is clear that the matter and form, according to the mode defined by the institutor of the sacraments himself, pertain to the substance of the sacrament, of which substance the Council of Trent speaks in session 21, chapter 2. The other ceremonies prescribed for signification and to present more expressly to the eyes the dignity of the sacrament are subject to the legislative power of the Church. Whence it is clear of itself that one not only must use the matter and form which pertains, whether certainly or probably, to the essence of the sacramental sign, lest the sacrament's administration be rendered invalid or dubious, but it is also necessary to observe the other prescribed rites from the most grave law of the Church, although these are not necessary for the validity, yet for the licéity of the administration of the sacraments. So, as I said earlier, the obligation of the ministers to follow the rites prescribed by the Church, the obligation is very grave, but that's because it is enjoined by the supreme authority of the Church. It's a grave law in a very grave matter, and this is why the transgression of the liturgical precepts is, or has been at least, has been punished so severely in the past, because it's not so much the ceremonies themselves, although obviously many of them are very ancient and go all the way back to the apostles or the direct successors thereof. The reason it's so grave is because the Church has commanded it very seriously. And there's a line from Cardinal Bona, I think. If anyone's familiar with liturgical authors, Cardinal Giovanni Bona is a very prominent name in the history of liturgical studies. I think he was in the 17th century, 17th century, and he wrote a very influential treatise on liturgical matters. Basically, it's just called Res Liturgicae. And somewhere in there he says that there's nothing intrinsically holy about the material ceremonies or rites themselves. Just the aspects of ritual taken in themselves. What makes them so venerable is the fact that they have been instituted by the Church, and especially by her most ancient authorities, to serve the administration of the sacraments, to adorn them, and to assist in signifying what they are and what they do. This is usually the way that they're characterized by St. Thomas and others. Oh, better put my laptop's almost about to die. When they're speaking about the rites and the ceremonies, they'll usually say it's they've been instituted for the solemnity or the reverence of the sacrament, and the obligation to observe them comes primarily from the fact that the Church has instituted and commanded them, and the fact that they're just so venerable and old. But I mean, to get into a different can of worms regarding changes of this sort, and I think you've mentioned it before, the changes in liturgical matters is like, especially with the example of one or two species, the Latin defenders of that change, such as Cardinal Torquemada, who talks about this in several places. I don't have them with me right now, but I've got them in notes. But usually what gets done is that, it's a fairly consequential change to the way that the faithful, receive the sacraments, or, a consequential change to the way in which the liturgy is done. But it's defended by theologians like Torquemada and others by saying that, it was judged opportune according to the circumstances of the time, and the church had the authority to do so, and it was done. Now, whether such changes were actually truly justified and did not, cause a great deal of damage that wasn't offset by the benefits coming therefrom, is a different historical question, which I don't feel qualified to answer, and it's an awful can of worms. But yeah, I'll try to. This is all over the place. But Franzelin, I'm gonna go we. Gaspari. Yeah, I need to put this together and publish it.
I think that'd be excellent. Very helpful. I'd love to read it. So as soon as you have that, let me know. And that way I can put a link in the description to this video for everybody else who wants to read it, because quite a few people in the chat are indicating they are finding this very helpful, which I am as well. And they would love to read more.
I apologize for the mode of presentation. This is not how I envisioned this would happen, but
no worries. Well, let me get to some questions here, if you don't mind. And like I said, you can always get the document to us, and we can read further. So would you say that based on what Trent is saying about the ability of the church, which would include the Pope, the supreme authority of the church, the ability of the church to modify certain aspects of the liturgy as long as they don't touch on the substance, would you say that then, at least in the eyes of the manualist, if one of those manualists were to be raised from the dead and hear people today saying that the Pope can't change the missal from the missal of 62 to 69, he can't make those kinds of changes, those are ultra vires, do you think those manualists would say, based on Trent, that that person is anathema? Or do you think that they would say, no, it's a little more complicated than that?
And the thing that first occurs to me is, I guess it would depend on what they mean by ultra vires. Like, in what sense are they talking of his power? Because in the basic and absolute sense, I'd say it's unquestionably the case that he has, I guess you could say, the raw authority to do so. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't get into the question of whether it is, I guess, useful or opportune.
Yeah. But no, there's people who would say that no, he can't. He does not have the power. He does not have the authority to modify the missal in the way that he did from 62 to 69. That's ultra vires. It's not that he shouldn't do it. It's that he can't do it. It's illegal. It kind of sounds like, based on what you've read from them, that they would see that as falling under the anathema of the Council of Trent. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think that is probably the case. Also, in the miraculous case that one of these manualists was actually resurrected, and it was explained to him what actually happened. I'm wondering how well he would take the news and the shift from one to the other, and whether that might possibly color his judgment. But my inclination would be to say that, at least as regards the potestas, the power, he would absolutely say this is within the bounds of the extension of his power. I guess I don't want to say juridical, because people will then accuse me of being a positivist or a legalist or something like that. But I mean, in this case, as Franzelin said earlier, everything but the matter and form of the sacraments falls under the legislative authority of the church. So in principle, all of that is, I guess, capable of being changed, even if not necessarily all of it will be changed.
Right. Now, you mentioned something about how prior to Trent and Pius V and the implementation there of the Roman Missal, you noted how there was an organic development on a local level, yet afterwards, it had to be pretty uniform. Any kind of development would not have been allowed on the local level since the lower shepherds could not modify the missal, only the supreme authority could. In light of that, does that then mean that Trent and Pius V effectively squashed the idea of the organic development of the liturgy from that moment forward?
This is actually something that I came upon that recently. It was either you or it was some video that I saw in the feed about Timothy Gordon and Timothy Flanders. And I think I started it, but I didn't get back to it. I think I had to go to sleep for work or something like that. I've been meaning to get back to it because I know that the whole topic of organic development gets into this whole thing because, I mean, frankly, I'm not really sure, and I need to do more reading on this, so this is tentative. I'm not really sure what. I don't have a clear picture of what organic development is supposed to look like in the concrete sense. I guess I have a vague picture, but the status of organic development as a limiting factor on the Pope's power of the liturgy, I'm not so sure that it is as absolute as others have said. And I know that some appeal, they say that because X or Y change did not come about organically, whatever that means, that means that change is, not good, not acceptable, possibly illegal. I don't know. But I don't think that is a substantial limiting factor. Because, I mean, in the first case, because it seems to me that there probably have been some changes which were not organic, at least in the sense intended.
Right.
I'm not sure about that bit. But there's a priest friend of mine who, when the question came up about organic development and what Sacrosanctum Concilium says about it, his sense of the role that it should play is basically that organic development is it's needed for good order. It's not needed for validity, laicity, whatnot. It's something that's required in order to keep at a minimum the disturbance or scandal that can occur from basically any legislative change. There's a line from St. Augustine, I can't remember, it might be from his book on baptism, but he's talking about change of laws, and it's usually brought up in manuals of moral theology when talking about ecclesiastical laws. And he basically says that when changing laws, you have to be careful, because even if there is some significant advantage annexed to the change, it's still going to cause, even if the thing it's changing into is really good, at the same time, because consuetude or custom plays such a strong role in confirming in the minds of the subjects, the authority and goodness of law, changing that, just, automatically is going to cause problems. It will perhaps cause them to think that the law maybe is not as firm or necessary as they previously thought, because, especially when people aren't really well learned in, I don't know, theology or liturgy or any of that stuff. If they see something that changes, in their minds drastically, just because, it's not what was going on before, it will diminish the authority in the eyes of the subjects. I think St. Thomas says that in the treatise on law. So yeah, I think that organic development, I guess it depends on what precisely they mean. I think there's a probable case to be made that organic development was, if not halted, at least slowed down significantly once Pius V consolidated the Western liturgy in 1570. Because obviously, apart from just I mean, you think of the difficulty of appealing to Rome, sending in a dubium about this practice which has begun or has been going on for 40 plus years in our diocese, and is this acceptable? Let the Congregation of Rites give a judgment on whether this is acceptable or whether we should root it out. That all takes work and time, and it's tedious. So it was a lot easier prior to that to just the bishop, as ordinary governor of his diocese, would, if he thought it needful, just introduce changes, maybe improvements, whatever. But yeah, I think organic development, at least in a fuller sense of the word, I think it's likely that it was severely limited. And so I guess you could say the good fruits that might have arisen from organic development were stifled. I mean, I'm sure it can also be said that there are good fruits of the centralization. It's one or the other. Either has its pluses and minuses, but yeah.
Buck Cooper asks, Session 22, Canon 7 of Trent. In reference to this, did you come across the Manualists discussing Session 22, Canon 7? I've seen the SSPX say they say the canon only applies to the traditional Latin Mass, so they're not anathema for calling the Novus Ordo offensive to God. That's the one. If anyone saith that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs which the Catholic Church makes use of in the celebration of the masses, let me see, are incentives to impiety rather than offices of piety, let them be anathema.
Yeah. If I'm being honest, I don't. I think I've come across that one a couple of times, but I don't recall it being used significantly by the theologians to discuss the supreme liturgical power. I remember being surprised when I came across it a while back because I was like, okay, this could be applied to the ceremonies and rites presently used by the Church. I don't see why they couldn't apply to the Missal of 69 as well as the previous missals. And I guess it also depends on how one is supposed to interpret the dogmatic content of that canon. When the council said that, was it only speaking, I guess, in a historical sense about the ceremonies which it uses now at this moment in 46 or whatever, or is it meant to apply in the future to whatever rites that the Church uses? I think either way, it doesn't militate against the new Ordo Missae. I'm sure that you can, I think it can come under criticism from other quarters, but in terms of that canon of Trent, I don't think. But I mean, I want to preface, a lot of the stuff, if it's unfamiliar to me or relatively new to me, I don't want to try to speak in a definite sense, because I would want to explore it more.
Sure.
And I haven't spent much time looking specifically for that canon as opposed to all the other ones. Right. So yeah, I'd have to do some more reading.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you coming on and doing this, Timothy. This was awesome. Go ahead and put in a plug for your blog or anything else that you want to make our viewers aware of.
Well, okay. Well, I unfortunately, up until recently, I haven't been doing much on it, but ever since this opportunity came up, I decided I should probably up my my productivity. So the blog is called Lumen Scholasticum. It's on WordPress. I don't know if you can.
Yeah. I'll put a link there in the description.
So that's
okay.
All right, that's the link.
Perfect.
And basically, I don't know. The blog is basically just a hosting site for translations that I've completed and that I want to have publicly available. There are a lot more, and hopefully I'll be able to get them out like within the year. But given my work schedule and just all the other difficulties that have risen up, especially after COVID, my productivity has gone down rather significantly. But I'm trying to ramp it back up again.
Well, I'm going to include a link to that in the description, as well as a link whenever you upload the document that you were using, in addition to the other quotes that we didn't have a chance to read over. I'm going to put that in the description as well. So everybody look forward to that. We're highly indebted to you, Timothy, for providing this information, just because it's stuff that you don't really come across very often. So thank you so much for doing this.
No problem.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you back on anytime you're wanting to discuss anything related to liturgy or the Manualists or anything you're reading. You're always welcome on.
Thank you. Hopefully, if that happens, I won't be such a.
It happens with tech issues. Believe me, I completely understand. I've had to do several shows on the fly with backup computers and mics and cameras, so I know how that goes. But again, thank you for coming on and doing this. It was very, very helpful, and quite a few in the chat indicated that they found it helpful as well. So, all right, well, everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. I'm going to be adding some new stuff on there within the next day or so. So go and check it out, and it's, of course, opportunity to support what we're doing here. All right, see you later. God bless.
Have you ever used a business service just to find out later that they publicly promote views contrary to God's law? If so, then check out StAnthonyServices.org, where you'll find a Catholic vendor in your area that will offer top quality services. Simply go to the website and share some basic information with St. Anthony Services, or call 1-877-LIFE-US1. What are you waiting for? Check out StAnthonyServices.org and support your fellow Catholic professionals today. And tell them R&T sent